Welcome, everyone, to the Australian Bitcoin podcast. I'm Justin, your host, and today I'm joined by Michael from VoltPay.app to discuss his Bitcoin journey and the recent release of VoltPay, a Lightning Network point-of-sale mobile application. But before we start, a quick word from our sponsor. The Australian Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by hardblock.com.au, Australia's first and oldest Bitcoin-only exchange. Hardblock aims to help their users save in hard money and to become self-sovereign Bitcoiners. Hardblock has no added fees on deposit, buy, or sell transactions, so the prices are what you see are what you get. Hardblock's Bitcoin withdrawal fees are also among the cheapest in Australia, including a very low 99 Sat Bitcoin withdrawal cost when using their new auto send feature. Check out Hardblock today. All right, Michael, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for being here. It's good to have a chat.
My pleasure. It's great to be on.
I mentioned at the top of the show in the introduction that you're the creator, the developer of VoltPay, which people can check out at VoltPay.app. And although I want to talk to you today about your Bitcoin journey, any tangents of kind of Bitcoin topics, and of course about VoltPay, maybe to start, could you just give people a bit of an introduction to what VoltPay is specifically?
Yeah, okay. So VoltPay is, in its essence, a point-of-sale app using Lightning and Bitcoin, obviously. And what I've tried to do with that is make it really simple to onboard merchants, retailers that don't have any experience with Bitcoin. So we can get them up and running, accepting Bitcoin for selling their products as quickly as possible, and they don't need to know about in-depth concepts like running their own nodes or managing liquidity and that sort of thing.
It's I've tested the app and I found it's what was missing in my mind in terms of there's a lot of Lightning wallets now, and they're very much for the customer, you could say, if you look at it in terms of like a customer and a merchant, they're very much being customer wallets. And even though as a merchant, you could use that as a merchant wallet, they're not really set up in that way, are they? Like they'll display your balance. There's no inventory that you can set up or choose from. So I think the app, from what I tested, it's brilliant. I think it's great. And I imagine there's probably a lot of features that you've got in mind, or even sort of tweaking what's already there. And maybe, I guess, we'll park that and come back to that stuff in a bit more detail later in the pod. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that from my experience of it, it seems like a much needed app, but also a very easy to use app as well. And it's got kind of all the features that it needs to. But rather than get too much ahead of ourselves, I'll try to do it like a bit chronologically. So why don't you tell us a bit about your Bitcoin journey, and even maybe weave into there a bit of your developer journey, as in like being a coder or programmer?
Yep. So I probably first heard about Bitcoin back in 2013 or 14, something like that. And like many people, sort of bobbed it off, didn't pay too much attention. I'm a pretty skeptical person in general, so I would have just dismissed it. That's a bit of an internet scam, sort of, that'll never take off. Didn't really think much about it. And then probably popped up again in late 2016, as with many people. I think there was one of the mainstream media news headlines of Bitcoin crashing. It's dead. It's never going to come back. And that prompted me to start looking into it. And I started digging. It took me a little while to gain the trust of, giving someone over the internet that I'd never met some money and wasn't actually going to receive anything physical. But after I did a bit of digging, figured it out and sort of jumped in. And from there, I never really looked back. And the further along I went, sort of just dug deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, and I've never stopped.
It's pretty hilarious that it was a mainstream media article saying that Bitcoin's crashed and is dead. That's what prompted you to be like, all right, hold on, let me have a bit more of a look into this.
Yeah. I think, as I said, I'm a pretty skeptical person, and I tend to be fairly counterculture. So I do like to go against the grain.
Yeah, definitely. And it normally, like, I have this mindset of whenever I see, especially a mainstream media news headline, I always think, why am I reading this headline, and why am I reading it now in particular? Like, this isn't just news. There is always some sort of agenda. And so when you can start looking at it that way, sometimes doing the opposite of what the mainstream media tells you to do is almost just a good starting point to say, like, that's where reality probably is. It might be a bit more nuanced than that, but that's the position I'll start from and try to figure it out from there, which sounds similar to what you did. You went, okay, I'm reading this for a particular reason now. There's an agenda here. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's the opposite to that. That's cool.
Yeah. You always have to do your own research, but generally, doing the opposite of what the mainstream tells you, it's a pretty safe bet.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Along your journey, so because you said around sort of like 2016 or so is when you saw that and started to get more into it. Yep. Was there any really kind of iconic books, people or experiences that really made you kind of like double down in some ways in terms of that confidence in it?
I started off, I ended up getting myself involved in, one of these trading groups and that sort of thing, with a bit of the alts in there and everything like that. And I could tell straight away that, most of the other things were not going to achieve anything. They were scams and people were just going to lose money. And so I, like everyone, I was a bit involved in it and that sort of thing, but it wasn't really for me. But I don't really know what it was, but Bitcoin just seemed different. So there was probably no specific information that I read, but just the culture around all the alts compared to the culture around Bitcoin is probably what drew me in.
It makes sense. Yeah. And do you think your background in development would have played into that a bit? Like, did that help you grok Bitcoin at that technical level, just to sort of see the engineering, elegance of it earlier on, or?
Not really. To be honest, I actually avoided a lot of not avoided, but I didn't really dive that deep into the technical side of it. I didn't read the white paper until 2020. So yeah, like I think leading into discovering Bitcoin, I was sort of pretty skeptical about everything going on in the finance world and that sort of thing. And I paid a lot of attention to currencies and different bits and pieces, and I knew things weren't right. So I guess the issues that I was seeing in the world of finance ended up connecting with the solutions that Bitcoin offered. So it just kind of clicked that way for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like, I don't know if you knew about things like Austrian economics back then, but you might have had a bit of that Austrian economics philosophy to you, especially when looking at the problems in the financial sector, the problem with currencies as well. And I know that was sort of baked in, obviously, very early into Bitcoin, and even like the cypherpunk movement and the crypto wars and stuff that predated it. So you're almost like on that same mindset, primed for something like Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I've been sort of very libertarian without knowing what libertarianism was and all of that sort of thing. So it just kind of came naturally. It felt right.
Yeah, definitely. Look, that resonates with me because I feel the same way when I discovered Bitcoin, and particularly after a couple of years of discovering Bitcoin and learning more about it and realizing like I had all these views of the world that now someone was able to like put a name to and put a framework to. And so like, hey, there's actually a lot of people that have been thinking this stuff for a very long time. And it's when it clicks, I guess. It gives it a bit more credibility.
Yeah, for sure.
So in regards to your development background, could you give a bit of a history there?
So I kind of just fell into being a developer. I knew that I wanted to be involved in IT and that sort of thing, but I never really knew what area of IT I wanted to be in. And so I was working in this company, and I ended up just solving problems that people had in the business. So I kind of fell into web development first of all, and that sort of thing, and got heavy into databases. Started hacking around with software that they had in this company and figured things out and how to pull out data that they needed for reporting and that sort of thing. So it just kind of happened that I fell into becoming a developer. From there, I moved into some small startup companies. I haven't moved around that much, but most of my work has been in startup companies. And I've done a lot of work in the real estate industry. I've built a startup which is basically a CRM that the real estate industry uses. So a lot of it has been evolved in technology for businesses and small scale things. So that's really where that sits.
Yeah. And what prompted you to transition to Bitcoin development, like app development?
So I'm still doing other things, obviously, but I really wanted to do something with Bitcoin. And for quite a while, I was just looking at it and researching and trying to figure out exactly what to do. It took me a while to get started on doing something, but I knew that I needed to do something with it to get my hands dirty. And it was probably in 2020 sometime, and started seeing everything that was going on in the world, and a bit of a divide between certain groups of people. And I felt like there was a real need for building an economy that people can't be excluded from. That was sort of the initial thought. And I guess there was an aspect of the point of sale concept that tied in with one of our other businesses. So we have a small scale market garden, and I could see where we could really use something like that for our business as well. And yeah, the point of sale just seemed like the logical place to get started with using Bitcoin. And the Lightning Network provides everything that you need to make that happen. Yeah.
True. Yeah, sounds like very kind of honorable motivations of just wanting to get your hands dirty and contribute to Bitcoin. But then having the problem that I know I've experienced, and I think probably a lot of people do have, is going like, well, where do I fit exactly? What's needed? Sometimes it's a bit overwhelming because there's so many different areas that you could fit into, but also sometimes it's overwhelming in the sense of not knowing the right one for you, your skill set, what's really going to be needed. So yeah, I think it's really good that you've got that past experience with the market garden, and I guess like circular economies, you could say as well, because that's probably what is now, in my mind, one of the most needed things with Bitcoin is to really kind of kickstart that circular economy. And to do that, we need the flip side of applications, which is for merchants in particular. How has your transition to, I guess, getting into Bitcoin generally, as well as getting into Bitcoin development, like more specifically, how has that been received by people around you, either people that you still work with in kind of traditional kind of like programming work that you do, or even like family members?
Fortunately, my wife is pretty much on board. I've convinced her over time, so that's always a good thing.
It definitely helps.
People around me in general, I don't really get much feedback from them. It's kind of it falls on deaf ears. Most of them probably think it's a big pipe dream and maybe a scam. But and in a sense, it's building the tools for point of sale. It's probably still too early. But I think we need to build it in order to get the circular economy started. If the tools aren't there, nobody's going to use the capabilities. So I guess I'm hopeful that eventually people around me will realize what's going on. And in the meantime, I'll just keep grinding away and try and convince people as much as I can, and eventually they'll come around.
I think you're absolutely right. Like, firstly, your experience with being a bit more counterculture throughout your life probably helps to not care too much about what the normies have to say about Bitcoin or Bitcoin app development. And I think you're also right in terms of, if we want a circular economy to really get going, the tools need to be there, even if they're underutilized to begin with. They still need to be accessible. And then, of course, knowing that all development's a very long-term game, that gives you the feedback that you need to help iterate further and really hone the tools for, by the time the market really starts to peak in terms of adoption and circular economies, at least there will be more refined tools.
Yeah, that's it. Like I've got started and we've got an app released. It's in the app stores and that sort of thing. People can download it and start using it. But from my point of view, it is really just the beginning. There's so much more we can build and so much more improvement that we can make. So yeah, we're better off being ready for when the masses come.
I'm curious, how long has VoltPay been in development for?
So I think I actually started putting down code at Christmas time. So yeah, about 6 months now, I guess.
Geez, that's very quick for the sort of features that are in there and just how useful it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean it's very basic, just getting started, as I said. So yeah, we'll keep going.
I'll mention some of the features that I recall from having tested it, and then maybe fill in the gaps of other features that it currently does. And then I'd even like to maybe talk about future features if that's not too sort of secret squirrel. So I think the parts that I recall most especially is being able to set up your own inventory as a merchant. And there was quite a lot of customizability in terms of you could set up categories of types of products, obviously very specific product. You could set up different types of units. So whether it's by weight or by a bunch of something, you could have set prices for things. But I like the fact that you could also add like a custom price in there as well. And the fact that you could kind of keep a bit of a running tally or like a shopping list that someone might have purchased. And then you check out towards the very end of it. Just that level of customizability, being able to like add or subtract certain amount of units, or again add in customizable amounts, seemed like something that would be very useful, because there's so many different ways it can be used, right? Like you could have a shop owner that has like 100 things in their inventory, so they literally add every single item. Whereas, say for example, if I were to use this in my role as a psychologist, I would probably have like 2 items. So it might not even be useful to set that up. I might actually then just sort of type in the amount each time, depending on the client. And so, I could just see a lot of usability in that regard. Obviously, being able to withdraw your, payments as well. I can't recall if there was a deposit, but at the same time, I guess if it's point of sale, you could just generate an invoice and pay to that invoice anyway. So it doesn't need a separate thing for it. That's from the top of my head what I can recall about it. Are there other features that are kind of significant that you think that are worth mentioning there?
Probably, I guess the currency, so you can quickly toggle between either a display in Sats and Bitcoin sort of thing, or you can set your own fiat currencies just to make it easier for display purposes. That's probably one of the main advantages. So a normie retailer could still price everything in dollars if they wanted, and that way it just works for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it'll be a while until Bitcoin wallets and point of sale apps are just in Sats. I know there are some apps like Samurai Wallet, for example, only displays Sats or Bitcoin amounts. They don't display any dollar amounts. And I understand the ethos or the intention there, but at the same time, there's still a lot of probably not complaints, but queries in their channel of people saying, "How do I see the dollar amount?" And they're like, "Well, this isn't a dollar wallet. This is a Bitcoin wallet." But I think it's going to take a while to get to that point. When you mentioned before, like it's good for merchants because then they don't need to set up things like their own node or even kind of understand that part of the process. What is what's the back end for the wallet? Like, where does it point to?
Yeah, so at the moment we're using Wallet of Satoshi for all the liquidity. So essentially, we're connected up through their node and their API. We are also going to offer the ability to plug in your own node, so you can go and connect up LND or C Lightning. So that will be coming. But yeah, Wallet of Satoshi powers the money side of it.
Very cool, and probably very accessible doing it that way as well, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
And I imagine because Wallet of Satoshi is probably so linked in with other nodes that would keep fees relatively low as well.
I've actually struggled to do a transfer in my testing that has cost anything. So yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Fees are pretty low.
That's what you want to see. What other features do you intend to integrate over time?
So at the moment, we've been working on LNURL and Lightning address. So essentially, probably I'd say in the next release, people will be able to set up their own VoltPay.app address. And that way you can do all sorts of things, like first of all, just print out a QR code or just give someone the address and they can transfer straight away. And it doesn't have to go through the point of sale side of things. We can do other things like static QR codes per product and that sort of thing. So that's probably something that's coming out in the next release. I've made some changes in the product display, so things are filtered a bit better by category and that sort of thing. Just some usability tweaks. Further along, I've actually got at the post office now. I have to go and pick up some NFC tags. So I've got a plan that I'm thinking about for essentially doing offline sales and also contactless payments. So you don't necessarily need to scan a QR code or touch phones or anything like that. So that will, I need to do some experimentation with that, but that's certainly coming. As I mentioned before, plugging in your own node. So essentially it will become non-custodial as well, optionally. And I guess that will work better for people that are further down the rabbit hole.
True.
They may not necessarily want to use Wallet of Satoshi for the liquidity, so they can easily plug in their own node and do things that way instead. What else have we got? It's a long list. So yeah.
I'm curious, just to go back a little bit. There was two things that jumped out that I'm not totally familiar how they would work. So I think that'd be cool to talk about. One, the static QR codes per product. Like, so how would that work in practice? What would be the benefit of that?
So you could do things. So all right, for our farm, for example, if we have a stall out the front where it's not manned, people could go and scan a particular product and pay like that without us necessarily being there. We could set up a price list that has a QR code next to each product, as an example.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how would the offline part work? Because I think that's probably a really good point. You don't want to be overly reliant on the internet, although obviously Bitcoin is an internet-based thing for the most part, but still there needs to be some level of routing around, I guess, if there is a power out or something along those lines. So how would that work exactly, the transaction?
When with the offline, it's not offline entirely. It's essentially if the merchant is offline, but the retailer would still need, the customer would still need access to the internet to be able to make the payment. So on the merchant side, it would just use that static QR to generate an invoice without the merchant actually being connected to the internet.
Gotcha. And then once the merchant is online, that would then they would receive those funds.
Updates.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And you're obviously sort of thinking out some of the more what am I thinking here? Like all the various use cases, I guess. It's not just going to be as simple as there being a shop owner always in a shop. Yeah, sometimes if you're doing like a community market garden or something along those lines, you don't want to have to be there all the time, and you probably don't at the moment. So it makes sense to work that into it.
Yep.
Yeah. Or even if you're in regional remote areas, there can be kind of issues with connectivity. So yeah, in terms of the market garden, I'm going to go down that tangent a little bit at the moment. So how did that come about?
So it was probably back in, I don't know, maybe 2013. I think we purchased this property that we're at now. It's a smallish property, but it's an acreage, so big enough to grow some veg essentially. We always were into growing our own food and that sort of thing, and saw a lot of issues with the food in the supermarkets. And I was always into researching about market gardens and all the chemicals that are used on farms and that sort of thing. So it was something that I was interested in, and we just started growing more food because we had more land, and then we ended up with too much food, so we sort of started putting it out the front on the table. And everyone in our street loved it, and kind of we couldn't grow enough all of a sudden. And from there, it's just grown and grown and grown. We've had a lot of setbacks doing it, and it's bloody hard work. It's not something you'd want to do to get rich or anything like that, but it's something that I think needs to be done just for feeding people, making shorter supply chains, and also making high quality food available for your local communities.
That's a really good point, because a lot of those things are deteriorating, aren't they? We have a reliance on things that aren't necessarily local, or very long supply chains that can be disrupted. We've got things like inflation, obviously, increasing the cost exponentially. Even things like the quality is degrading over time. So being able to sort of harden the community by making that more available internally, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of it, shops closing down or just everything being out of stock, and everyone has turned more to looking local, and supporting sort of small scale farmers and that sort of thing. a lot more. And there is a real demand for it. So I think, even if you can only grow a small amount, everyone should start looking at growing what they can. If you've got a lot of land, then look at cattle or chickens or something like that. But if, just use what you've got available, and everyone can grow their own food. So, yeah.
That trajectory that you mentioned is something that I've heard a lot, where you produce for yourself, then all of a sudden you've got a little bit too much, so you either give that away or you kind of do it as a community market garden. But then all of a sudden it gets to the point of like, geez, we need to scale this somehow. How do we do more? There's like just a constant demand here for it.
Yeah, there really is. Like, it's this year in particular. We just have been flat out. We haven't been able to keep up with it. So it's really, like all of our competitors, our local area, few farmers that we know, we're all friends and we all get along and we all help each other out and share inside information and that sort of thing. So it's really something that an industry where competitors actually support each other, and without like the demand there for that support, it wouldn't be the same.
It's very kind of reminiscent of an open network, or even the Bitcoin, a lot of the incentives of Bitcoin development, even Bitcoin mining, where you're competing, but you're kind of collaboratively competing towards the same goal, which is very different to a zero-sum game where you're trying to crush the other person to absorb that part of the market. Probably, or everyone realizes you can't be the only one there. You actually need each other to provide to the community, and then it's more so about how do you boost each other up and kind of get to that same goal.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Do you think that there'll be, like, of the people that you've kind of associated with in your community, both other farmers and I guess just the customers, I guess I don't have a better word for it, do you think they'll be receptive to something like Bitcoin?
It depends on the area. I think, and like in our particular street, for example, just keeping it very local, a lot of the people are older, so that's going to take a lot of convincing for them. But some of we do sort of midweek markets and that sort of thing. I think there's a real possibility that some people would be interested there because they're more younger areas and probably more affluent as well.
And I guess it depends on the like the usability or the utility for them as well. If people can still pay cash or do a bank transfer or something, it might beg the question for a lot of people of like, well, why go to Bitcoin? Because then I need to find an exchange and then buy it and then put it in a wallet and then transfer it to you. So there is a couple of those stumbling blocks initially, still, isn't there?
Yeah. There's definitely, and I guess even with the tax situation and that sort of thing, although we're pretty lucky in Australia that we have the exemption, effectively, it's still not ideal that most people don't want to spend their Bitcoin yet. They're wrong. They should want to, but not yet.
Definitely. Yeah. I always suggest spend and replace. Like if you really don't want to spend your Bitcoin, but you're going to buy more Bitcoin anyway, spend your Bitcoin and then replace it. Because it does help to really kickstart the circular economy. It feels really good too. Like once you start making Bitcoin payments and especially Lightning payments, you realize the power that it has.
Yeah, and it is something that although it's still early, if we don't get it started, eventually there's not going to be a Bitcoin without it. So, we need to start spending.
That's it. Like if you think of the trajectory of money, it goes from collectible, which Bitcoin's been through that point. It goes to store of value, which I think we're there now and have been for a couple of years even. And then it goes to, unit of exchange, which I think is happening definitely in pockets of the world. But if that is the phase that we're in at the moment, we need to find a way to, expedite that to then move to the point where it becomes a unit of account, which is that last point in a money's trajectory.
Yep.
I had another point there, but it slipped my mind. I do recall. So the personal use exemption, is that the one that you're referring to in terms of the tax? Yeah. So for anyone who's not aware of that, this isn't tax advice, obviously, because I'm not going to get it all 100% correct, but very vaguely speaking, there is a clause in our tax laws that says essentially if you are using Bitcoin for personal use, then it is exempt from capital gains tax. And there's a few stipulations around what constitutes personal use. Generally speaking, you want to make it very clear that you had intended it for personal use. So like you might have a whole separate wallet. If you're transferring out from a bank account to an exchange, you might even put in the description, intended for personal use wallet, something along those lines. But the tax laws are looking at things like, well, when did you spend it from when you bought it? Because if you're spending it 4 years after you bought it, it's probably not for personal use. Whereas if you're spending it within the next few weeks or the next few months, or even in maybe the next year, you could argue that potentially that is personal use. They also look at the price changes. And there's no clear guidance in terms of how much of a price change would then stop it being personal use. And of course, because the price does fluctuate a bit, that generally doesn't come up as much of a problem, because if you are dollar cost averaging, you're buying different lots of Bitcoin at different prices, which means when you're spending it, you can very easily spend an amount close to where you bought it, as in the value, if that makes sense, to sort of circumvent there being any issues of the tax office saying, well, even though you intended this for personal use and even though you spent it within about 2 or 3 months, the price went up 20%. So we think that's a taxable event. But generally speaking, if most Bitcoin is dollar cost averaging, you'll find some Bitcoin that you've bought that's similar to what you want to now spend it or sell it for. So that's kind of a way around capital gains tax, but in a legal way, obviously. They also have another stipulation where they expect that personal use is going to be something less than about $10,000. Now, the part that I don't recall is whether that's $10,000 per transaction, which is obviously a huge amount, or if they mean $10,000 in aggregate, perhaps per financial year or something along those lines. Either way, for spending Bitcoin, even $10,000 a year that seems like a reasonable level above. If we're talking about buying, market garden type things, or a few purchases online or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, if a lot of people are spending $10,000, that's going to be a pretty good kickstart to an economy. So yeah.
Definitely. Look, I do understand that there's quite a bit of work being done in the digital asset space, I'll say, because it is including all the other cryptocurrencies as well. And government is looking over the next about 3 or so years to do a lot of consultation to then set up an additional framework. So not trying to integrate digital assets back into the existing financial services framework, but to have a separate one entirely, and then even follow that up with different legislation changes. So that whole process is intended to take up to about 2025. So there's a bit of time between now and then, obviously. But at that point, I would expect, and at least from what they've said, that they're going to make the personal use clause clearer, but also broader. That way, things like peer-to-peer transactions can be, well, I guess, treated as they should, not a capital gains tax event. Of course, government sometimes says certain things and then other things happen. So 3 years is a long time. So we'll see. But it does seem like coming down the pipe, it's going to be something, that helps this process a bit more, I think.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing what comes out of it.
That's it. Going back just a little bit to VoltPay, is it primarily you that's working on it?
Yeah. So I'd look for a team. Need to sort of sort out some funding and that sort of thing before we can make it any bigger. But yeah, there's plenty to do. But at the moment, it's just me doing it.
I think that's it's a common issue in the Bitcoin space. Is like a lot of people doing really good work, but then getting it funded is the hard part. Unless you're shitcoining, and then all of a sudden you've got kind of infinite funding for marketing and development and everything else. Unfortunately, yeah, it's a frustrating situation. I know for a while. A while back, you were looking for a copywriter or a copy editor to spruik up the page, I guess, the VoltPay.app site, and maybe a couple of other things like documents and everything else. Did you come across someone to be able to do that?
I did. Unfortunately, I ended up going down the Fiverr route. Just the quality on Fiverr at the moment seems more suitable for what I needed. So it would be good to be able to access Bitcoiners to do the same thing.
Definitely. Yeah, I was surprised because when you posted that up, I thought, I'm sure there's like a, get paid in Bitcoin to do small jobs type website. And I think maybe we found like one, but it wasn't quite what we're looking for. And there's ones that you can get paid in crypto, which is obviously quite different. But yeah, I think that's a much needed area, like a Satsa or something like that. I think you kind of coined that term, get paid in Bitcoin, but in a Fiverr type way. Because Fiverr is hard to go past. Like even some of our illustrations we get done through Fiverr. If I ever offload some of the editing stuff that I do, I would probably be looking at Fiverr. But I also feel a bit dirty doing that because I'd rather support the Bitcoin ecosystem instead. But it's certainly not easy at the moment. There's not really like a one-stop shop to just like put up some, micro processing or micro jobs to get paid in Bitcoin for.
I guess the easiest option would be Fiverr. adds support for Bitcoin. But yeah, otherwise there's probably a good opportunity out there for someone to build a Bitcoin-based Fiverr.
That's it. What are some of the challenges that have come up with VoltPay so far?
Challenges. Ooh. Well, I originally had planned to add in support for AUD straight away. So I want to do things like instantly convert back to Australian dollars and give the merchant an option for converting back either a 10% or a 50% of the sale sort of thing. There's obviously regulations that get in the way of making that easy, and the other side is access to the liquidity. So sort of that's probably the biggest thing that I've had to shelve at the moment, but it's still something planned, and that will probably be an issue in every country that we try and tackle the same issue, same problem.
Yeah, it's kind of like trying to integrate something similar to what Strike is doing, where being able to use the kind of the payment rails, but not to force merchants to only accept Bitcoin, to give them an option, or maybe have like a little slider bar that says whenever I accept a Bitcoin payment, put 50% back into fiat or something along those lines.
Yeah, that was the concept, and in theory it's pretty simple, but the legacy world slows things down.
Yeah, true. I mean, the technical implementing that, I'm sure, is quite complicated, and especially getting that around the regulatory side of things too. Still, it sounds like a good thing to have on the roadmap in future.
Yeah, and we'll get it eventually.
Going a bit back to like the market garden, and you were mentioning like the quality of food, and in that, did you go down the rabbit hole of things like regenerative farming or regenerative agriculture, using farm animals like cattle and that sort of thing to help restore the land a bit more?
Yes, so we've dabbled in that a bit. We had goats for a while, and they were clearing. We've got a lot of privet and lantana and various different weed species, and for a while we were using goats to clear areas of our property and that sort of thing. The way we approach our farming is essentially, it doesn't strictly fall under the regenerative category, but we use very similar methodologies, and obviously we avoid any kind of chemical and that sort of thing. Everything is all organic based, and we, as far as like organic certification goes, we're probably what we call beyond organic. There's things that you can use in organic farming that we just stay away from as well, and most of what we do is focusing on building the soil rather than growing vegetables. The vegetables are a byproduct of what we're trying to do, which is restore the quality of the soil and restore the land. So we do that side of it, but we're also sort of pretty deep into the regenerative area. And I guess if we had more land, which fingers crossed won't spread any rumors just yet, but yeah, you never know what might happen. We would end up sort of stacking farm animals, I suppose, is one way you could explain it. So we'd get into beef, and we'd follow them with chickens and all that sort of thing. So restore the land that way.
It's a really cool way to orient yourself, isn't it? And it's very different to like a commercial operation that says we need to produce produce basically, and we need as much of it as we can, as quickly as we can, and to distribute it as far and as wide as we can. And instead of looking at that, you're looking at how do we make the soil healthy, because good product will come from that with the right quality. And yeah, even that point you made about you're kind of beyond organic, and there's some things that are even allowed in organic that you don't necessarily use, because I imagine that's come from research and realizing what is actually required and what isn't. And it's always interesting just that we will almost be indoctrinated to accept a certain term to mean something, like organic is like all natural or something along those lines. But no, there's certain thresholds. You're allowed to have certain amounts of certain things in there that probably shouldn't be in there. If you had your own choice, you probably wouldn't put them in there, but this is allowed for, the commercialization of the term organic. So it's, it's a bit of a rabbit hole there, and it's like never ending in some ways. I'm curious, do the farmers that are around your area, are they kind of at that same par in terms of regenerative agriculture and understanding like what truly is organic and so forth, or Are they still sort of like in the legacy system of saying, no, you don't really need to do that, or actually I can get better produce if I just don't worry about, regenerating the soil? Like, where are they on that sort of spectrum of adopting that?
Yeah, there is some classical farmers in the area, and they tend to sell their produce, through the Sydney markets or the traditional routes. But we're involved in a sort of co-op where all of the farmers that we deal with, that we're in communication with, they're all regenerative, and they vary. There's some doing cattle and some doing chickens and ducks and that sort of thing, and there's a few market gardeners, and so there's quite a good environment around us for that scene.
That's really good.
Pretty strong here. Yeah.
It definitely seems to be a bit of a cultural shift. At least, maybe it's just the fact that I didn't hear about regenerative farming very much in the past, but now I have because of Bitcoin. But it certainly seems like there's more and more people that are starting to understand the benefits of that, and of course the downsides of things like, monocropping, excessive use of nutrient and fertilizers and that sort of thing, what it does to the soil and the runoff into rivers or wherever else. And it's kind of funny that you mentioned there's some classical farmers still, because the further back you go, you would almost say that regenerative agriculture would be the classical one, wouldn't you? Or like the more traditional, and then it's changed. Similar to economics, where like Austrian economics, and then we've got classical economics. Whereas if you go back far enough, Austrian economics is the classical economics. But it's one of those, like, with society, government, industry, whatever, all of those things together have coined a particular term, like classical or organic, and it means something very specific, not exactly what we think it always means. It's just funny that way.
Yeah, things always were done, the way we're going back to, and it's big business pushing for profits that have driven it away from that, and it became more about kilograms of meat that we can produce on this small area of land, maximizing profits and that sort of thing, as opposed to maintaining the land, improving the land, and having production as a side effect, effectively.
That's it. And it's the way that you're doing it is so much more low time preference, isn't it? Because it gives you that sustainability to know that you can continue growing good quality foods that's good for the environment and good for the community, versus the high time preference approach of saying, like, we just need better production or more production now. But then, of course, it becomes more and more difficult to grow in future, and it takes longer to restore the land back to the way that it was.
For sure.
But that's the profit-driven system, I guess, is a very sort of short time frame.
That's it. They need to get things in the ground or growing as fast as they can and turn it around so they're making profit straight away. Whereas we've sort of been building our soil for 8 years, and we'll be building it probably for another 8 years. It's just whether if we start a new block of growing space in the first season, especially, we don't really expect too much out of it. Anything we get is good, but we don't bank our livelihoods on just that new block. We give it time to improve.
I think that's what needs to happen, isn't it? It's like crop rotation almost. Sometimes you're going to have a piece of land that might not be specifically usable for a crop, this season or even for the next couple of years. But if you've got enough parcels, you can kind of rotate those things around and play that long-term game.
Yeah, that's it.
One of the tangent topics that you mentioned before the podcast, I'm keen to talk a little bit about, which is like sled dogs and sled dogging. Is that a thing in Australia? And also, how'd you get into that? Yeah, tell me a bit about sled dogging.
It is a thing in Australia. It's pretty different to what you might see in Canada or Alaska. But we do it in Australia. We're quite limited with temperatures, but it's definitely a thing. So we're involved. We've got Malamutes, and we've also just started with racing line Siberian Huskies. So the Malamutes, they're like your freight train sort of thing. They're fairly slow compared to the other dogs, but they will just keep going and going. You can't stop them. Whereas the Siberian Huskies are much smaller, lightweight, and they like to go fast. And they also won't stop, but they don't pull the weights as much. They just go for speed. So I guess in Australia we do dryland sledding mostly. So we go to state forests and hook up either a scooter or 3 or 4 wheel rigs behind the dogs, and let them rip. And it's not until they get in their harnesses in the forest that they're, truly happy. You see what they're doing, what they're made for. So it's really good.
Yeah, they're bred for it. Is it true what they say about huskies? And I don't know if Malamutes is sort of the same thing, but I know about huskies. They say they're very difficult to train. They're very strong-willed, kind of stubborn. Is that true, or is it more so like they need to be given the right thing to train with, like sledding?
So I would say it's probably more the other way around, that Malamutes are a lot more stubborn than huskies. Huskies they're mental, absolutely mental. But if you put them in a harness, they know what to do. So you don't really need to teach them to run. It's in their blood. They do it. You do have to teach them things like how to turn left and right. So there's challenges there, but it's in their blood, and they pick things up pretty quickly.
How did you get into that? Why did that pique your interest?
I think when I was a kid, I had a friend of the family sort of thing that had a Malamute, and I saw that, like, this was when I was quite young. I saw his dog and thought it was the coolest thing in the world. It looked like a wolf. So ever since then, I wanted one. And it wasn't until, I think it was probably 12 years later that I managed to get my first dog. And pretty much since then, I've added a dog every year. So it's nice. a bit of an addiction. Goes against everything that is, Bitcoin, live poor and stack sats. But, we've all got to have our fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hobbies are always like that, isn't it? It's like if you're going to buy something, just like upgrade to the next one because you're going to buy that anyway, or don't get one, get two because you're going to eventually get two.
That's it.
And yeah, look at Malamutes and Huskies. They're really beautiful dogs. So I grew up in Sydney, and is the Husky like sled dogging community relatively small? Like, is that relatively niche in Sydney, you would say?
It is. So there's really like sort of 1 or 2 clubs in each state. I think, I don't think there's anything in Northern Territory. But every other state territory has a club, at least one club. But we all know each other, sort of thing. So yeah, it's not a huge sport.
One of the reason that I ask is I don't think they're into this anymore. And to be honest, I think they might have passed away. This is people that I knew when I was very, very young in Sydney, but Dot and Ivan, and I don't know the last name. And I know
Dot and Ivan.
That is hilarious. Such a small world, because they were into that obviously from, all the time that I knew them when I was a kid. And I moved to Adelaide when I was about 15, kind of lost contact. But yeah, my understanding was that they're relatively big in that community and industry.
Yep. They're still around. I think I've seen Ivan. He tends to be a judge at the races occasionally. He gets asked to do that. They're not racing anymore, obviously. But yeah, he's
That's
around.
Really cool. Well, look, I'll perhaps let you know my parents' names, just like first name or something like that, in Messenger afterwards. And please let them know that that you and I had a conversation about Bitcoin on a podcast, because I'm sure they'll remember my parents, and they'll probably remember me as well. It's just hilarious. Such a small world.
Crazy.
That sort of stuff happens in Adelaide all the time, but the fact that it's Sydney and we're in 2 different states, beautiful.
2 states over.
I know. I had another question, particularly about VoltPay, but it sort of slipped my mind to go back. I know we're sort of jumping around the place, but I'm just sort of doing it as the train of thoughts in my head. I guess the question that I had was, if people wanted to get into either helping with your project or even just generally speaking, like coding and Bitcoin development, like what kind of advice would you give someone who's, looking to get into that space?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to get involved with VoltPay specifically, I'm sort of open. So yeah, jump on and send me a message. Probably Twitter's the easiest way. In general, I think there's a lot of projects out there, open source projects that, really appreciate contributions. So start reading code, start reading what projects are about and that sort of thing, and get involved, talk to people. Most developers are happy to help and, guide you in the right direction and that sort of thing. Pick a language and just start playing or do some courses. JavaScript is, fairly in demand these days, so it can never hurt to start with that. Yeah.
That's good. That makes sense. Yeah, JavaScript, in my understanding, is a pretty all-round language. And I think the other main point there is, get in contact with people. A lot of it is having a project as well. I think having a focus always helps. Like when you have a problem to solve, it's very motivating to then find ways around it versus just constantly doing kind of courses or tutorials and then not really knowing how it applies. So yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah, for sure.
Unless there's anything that's still on your mind about VoltPay, dog sledding, regenerative farming, or circular economies and market gardens, I was planning to maybe shift gears and just to talk a bit more broadly about Bitcoin. Having said that, if there is anything that comes up about any of those topics in future, just let me know and we can jump back to that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But what at the moment really excites you about Bitcoin?
What really excites me about Bitcoin?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? Because it's like, I don't know, there's a very long list and you're getting me to choose one. You don't have to choose one. You can have a few things if you want,
there's so much. I think the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it does cover so many different broad topics. I've got into psychology because of Bitcoin. I've done a lot of research in that area, I now know a lot more about economics than I ever did before. So I think the amount of content that's out there for people to learn things and open their minds, that's really exciting for me. I'm forever listening to podcasts and reading things and learning new stuff. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing.
Absolutely. And it's funny because it's almost like it's related to Bitcoin, but it's not necessarily related to Bitcoin, is it? Because you learn about economics in the context of Bitcoin, but then it shows you about economics more broadly than that too, or about different philosophies or even psychology. It's very, I've found that too. It's very kind of mind expanding. And I don't know if Renaissance is the correct term, but I do feel like we're rediscovering a lot of knowledge or even technology, if you want to call that, from the past, and realizing it's always been just as useful as it is, and it's always been practical, but we've kind of lost our way at some point in human history, and we've sort of deviated from that, probably because the incentives are broken, which makes sense. But yeah, I feel the same way actually. I think just understanding low time preference and understanding all of this stuff is connected and money is at the root of it. But understanding all those other aspects is still, very fascinating and very useful to integrate in life. Yeah.
It goes to show that, money is connected to everything and Bitcoin is money. So Bitcoin is everything.
Yeah, absolutely. But people think you're crazy when you say that sort of stuff. And not just you, me as well. It's
we may be crazy. We may be crazy, but it's just the way it is.
I think if you look at the definition of crazy, we probably are, because we're certainly outside the norm. We're like a couple of standard deviations above the mean, which means that we're abnormal for sure. Or I'd say we're exceptional. Maybe that's a nicer way to look at it.
We'll go with that.
Yeah. I do know a lot of normies get very frustrated when I can bring everything back to Bitcoin somehow. And sometimes they even throw that out as a joke, like, oh, can you bring this back to Bitcoin? I'm like, well, let me go. So What about things that concern you about Bitcoin or threats to Bitcoin that you think might be on the horizon?
Yeah, the biggest thing, that is looming, I think, is probably the idea of regulatory capture. If we all know regulation is coming in one form or another, and it could go really well, or chances are it could go the opposite. And I think we just need to keep that in mind and be protective, defensive, just to make sure that it doesn't get eaten alive without our knowledge, without us seeing it coming.
Yeah,
so
very
true.
true.
Be prepared for it.
I watched something, I've seen it before, but I watched it actually yesterday. It's just called Cypherpunks Write Code. And I think it's linked from the Sailor Academy, kind of introduction to Bitcoin course. It's just like a 40-minute 4-part series in like 40 minutes in total. That is, each one being about 10 minutes. It's on YouTube. So if you just look up Cypherpunk's Write Code, I'm sure you'll find it. I'd say you, not you specifically, Michael, but like everyone. And they were so prescient, when they discovered encryption technology and realized like we have sort of two pathways with the internet, and I guess encryption in there as well, is that we either go down this completely totalitarian, draconian, like panopticon kind of situation, or we have decentralization and individual freedoms and privacy and security restored in a way that it never was before. But that, like at that time, people thought that was a little bit like, that's very far-fetched, or it's not that extreme. And that was in like early 70s, throughout the 80s and 90s. And I think it's very prescient, because that's essentially the cusp that it seems like we're on at the moment. We've got like a fork in the roads where we either go full totalitarian state with surveillance, no privacy, or we go the opposite, because we have things like Bitcoin and encryption technology for messaging and whatever it might be. So I think you're right. Like regulatory capture, like regulation is coming, but I think there is still a lot of hope in terms of being able to, use Bitcoin in the way that it was intended, and in a way that doesn't necessarily like go against regulation, but kind of works with it. One of the things that's been going on recently, I wasn't planning to talk about this, and I don't have like a whole lot of technical understanding of it, but I got a bit, is like BIP 119, or BIP, which is like all around covenants and OP check template verify. Like, have you been following some of that?
I haven't really dug into it that deeply, so I'm not really across it too much.
Well, rather than put out a bunch of stuff that's not quite accurate, we won't talk about it then, because I know me being vague, and if you haven't looked into it too much, that might not be that useful. But I think like those sort of things, I guess I can talk about it more broadly. That's where a lot of people seem quite concerned about BIP 119, is the potential for it to be used for regulatory capture, like permanent whitelists, which I know the common debate is that, that's already kind of possible with like 2 of 2 multi-sigs at the moment. But yeah, I think it's something that as we go, it's going to need more and more to be on people's mind, is like, how could this be used against us in some way? And I guess the thing that I can talk a little bit about is things like, privacy enhancing transactions. So like things like coin joins and coin swaps, like atomic swaps, all that sort of stuff really seems to be hitting this exponential curve at the moment in terms of things being released. And I do think like regulators are well behind the 8 ball in terms of how do you figure that stuff out, but also how do you police that? How do you control it? And I think it's like the horse is bolted to some degree. I don't think they can come back and say you're not allowed to coin join, because that's just such an integral part of Bitcoin. But I guess the point is, as the regulatory, whatever you want to call it, heats up, it's going to be really important to keep making tools that are kind of in line with that Bitcoin's values and Bitcoin ethos, and that prioritize, security and privacy, regardless of what regulation we think might be coming. It's like, make the tool now, use the tool now, and then regulators tend to sort of like form around what's already there.
Yeah, and I guess as long as we keep pushing the envelope, we can stay ahead, and regulation won't necessarily catch up to everything. So as long as we stay aware of it, I'm sure things will work out fine in the end.
True, me too. And I've got a lot of confidence in Bitcoin. And I think as I've gotten further into Bitcoin, I've realized it's like an ongoing thing. Maybe initially when I finally grokked Bitcoin, I'm like, I get it. I should be all into this thing. I had this just belief of like, it's inevitable. Like there's nothing anyone can do to stop this. It's going to be the thing. But now that I'm further into it, I realize like it's going to be a constant battle, similar to the crypto wars and encryption and it trying to be outlawed, but then being, registered as free speech and all that sort of stuff. Like it was a cat and mouse game. There's constant, efforts to break encryption or to have backdoors that sort of circumvent encryption. And constantly on the other side, there's like better advancements in encryption and steganography and how to use it. So yeah, I think it's going to constantly be like that, isn't it? Where we've got a bit of a head start, but we just need to keep making use of that and keep iterating on the tools that are useful. So in terms of Bitcoin, it's sort of what you're bullish about or excited about, and some things to be concerned about or maybe cautious about. If you're talking to people about Bitcoin, I guess this is sort of like orange pill techniques. What sort of things how would you approach it, basically?
It's still something I'm working on. It's not necessarily my forte. I'm a code guy. But I guess you need to make people aware of the problems. So inflation, for example, you make people that aware that they're losing their purchasing power, and once people see that the problems exist, it makes it easier for them to understand that there is another option out there to work around those things. So it's probably you need to wake people up by making them well aware that not everything is a-okay at the moment.
I get this impression that that conversation is becoming easier to have, especially as people start to feel the weight of especially food and energy, all the kind of non-discretionary goods, or whatever you'd call them, going up in value. Like inflation is becoming a real thing for many people, and although the government will probably keep trying to push the number, around 5% or lower, in even having said that, 5%, 5.1 at the moment is pretty damn high for Australia. I think it's since like 2001 or something. It hasn't been that high. So I think this conversation is becoming more acceptable for people to have, to offer a bit of an explanation of like why this might be happening. Whereas if we go back a couple of years, whenever I tried to talk about things like inflation or what is money in the first place, most people would switch off because they're like, look, you're talking about America's economy. That's not the same here. And there's a lot of ways you could argue the point of like, well, America's economy influences ours, but essentially people would dismiss it in that regard. Whereas now they're seeing it in their day-to-day life. It becomes much more salient, and people are looking for answers to say like, well, why is this happening and what can I do about it?
Yeah, I think, I don't know why exactly, but I think in Australia there's a culture that people don't really talk about money. And as you say, it has changed a lot recently. There's a lot that's happened over the last 2 years that has made a lot of people more aware of what is happening, and probably there's more of a culture that it is acceptable to talk about it now. So hopefully that works in our favor, and we can leverage the issues to orange pill many more people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, culture is complicated, obviously, but I think we do get taught from a very young age to not pay attention to money. Like, money doesn't buy happiness, and only the greedy care about money. We do have kind of a strong tall poppy syndrome type culture in Australia as well, where if you are incredibly successful and have a lot of money, you might not be looked as kindly upon by, the general population. And so to some degree, it's like, it's one of those unspoken things. And I think that's what just keeps it off people's minds. Or if it does seem to become like a salient topic, they don't want to be the one bringing it up or talking about it or seeming like too money focused. But geez, once you realize like it's at the core of everything and it's meant to be representing your time and energy, it's a pretty important conversation to have. So yeah, I hope we see more and more of that trend of people waking up to the issue, so you can kind of like, just feed a little bit of the solution there as well.
Yep. And that's probably the approach we'll have to take. So we'll just see how things go.
That's it. Any other Bitcoin tangent topics that you've found have kind of come up for you in life that we haven't talked about already? I mean,
tangent topics. I'm sure there is. Oh.
You mentioned before that you kind of learned a bit about psychology from, not necessarily from Bitcoin, but that sort of like kind of got you into it. Is there any like sort of general topics that you've sort of looked into, or any kind of applications to your life that you've sort of applied what you've learned?
So, well, gonna get pretty personal here, but over the last few years, I've had a pretty rough time. My previous business partner passed away, had cancer, passed away, and I ended up taking over the business. Had to do a whole lot of stuff that I wasn't used to, and that sort of thing. And that was right before COVID hit. So I put together a team of friends, effectively, that fit into certain roles. And then COVID came along and has basically halved the business. So I've gone through a rather rough period of dealing with all of that sort of thing, and having to tell some friends, which never employ friends, but not that they did a bad job, but it just makes things rather uncomfortable.
True.
Had to let some of them go and that sort of thing. So pretty rough time, and I was struggling through all of that, and then it just seemed to be one thing after another just knocking me over. our property has flooded pretty badly 3 times over the last 3 years, and the list goes on. And so all that sort of stuff knocked me around a bit, and I was struggling to dig myself out of a hole, pretty bad depression and everything. And there was some podcasts that I was listening to that some Bitcoiners gave me, or not gave me, but mentioned things about depression and that sort of thing, and it just really hit home. So I started digging into that side of things, and looking at ways to approach sorting out these issues, I suppose. So it's a pretty personal thing, but without necessarily Bitcoin and all the podcasts that I was listening to and everything like that, I probably wouldn't have come across the information that I needed to get myself, pull myself up by the bootstraps and get on with it. So yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the phrase "when it rains it pours" is pretty applicable here.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry to hear about your business partner, and then kind of life just likes to really like throw the curveballs all at the same time in terms of COVID striking, then having to have a lot of difficult conversation with friends, and even floods on the property. It's just having to deal with a lot of shit. It makes it very difficult to then find like what's the core thing that should kind of keep getting you through. Like, what are your values? How do you make sense of it, or find some sort of meaning and continue going forward? Because those are the sort of times where we kind of decompensate. We shut down, or we go backwards. Things get self-destructive sometimes, and making some sort of sense of it, basically, getting some sort of support, sometimes even just like from community and family, and moving forward. It's really important. And I feel like a lot of people are going through parallel, maybe not always similar, obviously, but like parallel journeys in that regard over the last couple of years, like especially with COVID, and particularly like the government and cultural response to COVID, maybe more so than even just like COVID itself. It's changed a lot of things, like even for me personally. And Bitcoin, and especially people like John K. Vallis, Greg Foss. Look, his name sort of slipped my mind at the moment, but people that just like talk very real and about their own experiences, and talk about things like meaning, even things like a bit of spirituality, helps to put things into context, and helps to then figure out, like what is the thing that you want to drive your life? Where do you want to derive meaning from? And the fact that like living a life of meaning is not usually fun all the time. It's actually blood, sweat, and tears, and challenging. It's like all the things that we are really going to make us satisfied are on the opposite end of like hard work, basically, or on the other side, of hard work. So sometimes just knowing that other people are going through the same kind of thing, and having a way to like orient your life and know what to focus on helps you get through those times. So it makes sense. And I can kind of resonate or reflect that I've had a similar journey over the last couple of years too. Bitcoin certainly helped, and Bitcoiners talking about these kind of things and talking about what helped them helps as well.
There is a name that has slipped. I was going to drop it, but
if I think of any more that have been instrumental, at least in my journey, I'll chuck them in the comments.
It was a recent podcast.
It's not like a Preston Pish or a Jeff Booth or any of those names.
Jeff Booth. That's it.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to hear. Sure.
Yeah, I listened to one I think it was a couple of days ago with Greg Foss, Jeff Booth, Preston. Can't even remember who was actually hosting it now. I think it was John K. Vallis, actually. And Greg Foss talked a lot about his history and like suicidality, and just sort of like, life kind of falling apart at various points. But then, of course, he's really brought it around. And part of that was, him resetting and going like, what's important to me, and what should I be focused on, and what should I expect from life as well. And so, that's...
The Jeff Booth one was the what Bitcoin did recently that he did. That was a really good one. And he was pushing towards basically, taking a positive approach to everything, rather than, being so negative about everything. I can't explain it that well, but that was a really good podcast. So
I listened to that one too, and he So sometimes I get this impression like I'm going to listen to a Bitcoiner that I've heard 20 times before and they're going to be talking about the same sort of stuff.
Same
Sometimes
thing.
they
Yeah.
do, but there's always little tendrils, little tangents that come out that give you those like epiphany moments. And yeah, like one of the things that I took away from his, and maybe I can put it into like psychological terms, is that like our mind is a bit like a garden, and you kind of need to cultivate the things you want more of. And your mind will often throw you a lot of good stuff, but it'll actually throw you a lot more bad stuff, because our brain is like a do not get killed problem-solving machine, just from like evolutionary reasons. So it's going to think of more negatives than it will positives. And where we sometimes go wrong is we spend a lot of time on the negatives, either trying to like fix them or problem solve them. And it's kind of like pulling out weeds of the garden. The problem is there's always going to be another thing that pops up, another weed that pops up that we'll need to attend to. And the more we attend to them, interestingly enough, the more we'll get of them. And of course, we let the actual stuff in the garden, the positive things, the nice flowers, the stuff that produces, that all starts to wilt because we're not giving it the right attention. And so interestingly, probably similar to gardening, psychology says, well, we should actually pay more attention to the positives. Like if there's a negative that seems reasonable, rational, urgent, important, then sure, we problem solve, seek some support, do something to work through it. But if it's just like negative rumination, like going around and around on a particular topic or catastrophizing about the future, being able to recognize the thought in a kind way to say, well, thanks for that, mind, but I don't really need to focus on it at the moment. Here's this other thing that I'm working on that's more important, or here's this relationship that I should appreciate a bit more, or here's this thing that I want to do to make myself healthier. And by doing that, it's kind of like tending to the garden. It's laying down ground cover so weeds don't actually come through anymore, because the ground cover gets the majority of the sun, the majority of the nutrients. And just by focusing on the plants that you want, the positive, not to be delusionally optimistic, but the more reasonable, positive sort of thoughts or experiences, they tend to be what dominates. Because there's always going to be some shit in life that actually makes us think negatively, and our brain is always going to make us think negatively regardless. So being able to like acknowledge it, kind of accept it, but then shift our focus back to something that's more positive, usually puts us like physically in a good space as well, because we start to do things that are more positive for ourselves. But it lets us, control's not the right word, but it lets us sort of roll with our mind space a bit better, where there's always going to be, kind of a garden that we can choose to experience, like a positive one, especially if we spend more time with it. And that's, I guess, summary in some ways, like what I got from Jeff Booth's talk, because he was talking about, look, that we're at a fork road, or a crossroads where things could be really, really bad, or things could be really, really good. And actually, it's kind of always been like that. If you go back in history, there's probably always been a crossroads to some degree that culture and society is dealing with. And so trying to look at, the optimistic side of it and to do something productive and positive with it is a very powerful thing, and a good way to feel like you're in a bit more control of the situation, and to be a part of a community that's doing the same thing is very reinforcing, and a good way to cope.
That is, that's a perfect summary of that podcast, but also I think a perfect summary of my journey. So yeah, you've just summed up exactly what I've been through and exactly the approach that I've taken to pull myself out of it. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, and that's been helpful for me as well on a personal basis. And look, even in my work in psychology, that's certainly been very helpful for a lot of other people as well. So yeah, hope that helps someone.
Yeah, we just turned it into a psychological session.
That's it, exactly. Well, again, Bitcoin is at the core of everything. We've talked about a lot of different topics today, but it's all quite relevant, really. It's all quite relatable. Any final thoughts before we finish up about any of the things that we talked about, or anything else that's on your mind?
I think for anyone out there that is in a similar situation to I was when I was thinking about VoltPay, getting that started. If they're not sure what they want to do, just find something and get started, get stuck in, and grind away one step at a time and make something happen. There's plenty of room out there for many people to be doing the same thing, or team up and that sort of thing. Just get started.
Absolutely. Like if you need motivation, well, I don't think you need motivation if you're into Bitcoin and surrounded by Bitcoiners, but at the same time, just look at things like Bitcoiner jobs, just see the amount that's out there. that is how in demand it is to be into Bitcoin, to be doing something in the development space or product management space or communications. There's so many different areas you could slot into, as well as like the free open source projects that need a lot of support and a lot of love. I think just looking at all the opportunities is a really good motivating factor. And I think you're right. It's like time's the secret ingredient, isn't it? And obviously like doing something during that time. So just start chipping away.
Yep, that's it.
Whenever I used to draft things, I used to hate drafting, but at the same time, like just embracing the fact that it's a draft. Like this isn't going to be great. This is probably not going to be even close to what it ends up as. But if I just start drafting, the rest of the process becomes much easier because I start to realize where are my gaps in my knowledge, which parts are my strength that I can kind of like hone down a little bit more, and like what's the general flow of things, what's the general pathway I should be taking. So it's a bit of a strange metaphor, but I often see life similar to that, where I'm like, I just need to start drafting, and the rest of it will kind of come quite naturally after that point. So yeah, if you're waiting to get started, just start drafting.
I think development is the same. A lot of people like to plan everything out beforehand and have a full roadmap of where everything's going, but I really find that if you start building something, you're going to find exactly where it will work and where it won't. So yeah, same concept.
Very true. So where can people follow you? It's the VoltPay is VoltPay.app. But do you have it like Twitter and Facebook?
Yeah, so the Twitter for VoltPay is same thing, VoltPay.app. And yeah, I haven't actually set up any of the other socials at the moment, so just on Twitter will be the best way.
No worries. And how about for yourself? Did you want to mention your personal one? I haven't mentioned it so far, so we can either leave it out or put it in depending on what you like.
Yeah, the personal one's fine too. So that's TALEJ, I think, on Twitter.
No worries. Yeah. I'll look it up. Look, it's probably quite likely that you've already associated VoltPay with your Talledge or the Michael. Yeah. But just in case you hadn't, I didn't want to like dox that.
Yep. All good.
No worries. Well, unless there's anything else on your mind, we can end it there and
I think that's probably about it from me. I've done a lot of talking.
That's the point. Well, thank you. I really do appreciate the time. And, if you're keen to come back on, in maybe a few months or something like that, just to talk about where VoltPay is up to and any kind of, future things that are coming down in terms of development, always happy to talk about that sort of stuff. Cool. And we'll sprinkle in some regen, community market gardens and sled dogging and stuff as well.
Chuck in some sled dogs, yeah. Indeed. Coming into winter, so I'll fill you in on the racing season.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, one final point about the sled dogs. Do you use them apart from like training and for competitions? Like, do you ever use them to like move stuff around property or something like that?
Yeah, we haven't for a little while, but the Malamutes especially, they're great if we've got a big log or something that we want to drag around to a pile that we're stacking up. So yeah, they love. We have separate harnesses for sledding and weight pull, so we'll hook them up with a weight pull harness and they dig in and
that's
love
great.
Love to pull a weight around.
I'm sure they do. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sometimes we need to realize like what animals, especially like certain types of dogs, were bred for as well, because they're not always, I want to say used, but that doesn't feel like the right word, but they're not always used for the purpose that was intended, and that is actually not going to be the best thing for their own mental health as well. So I think it's really cool to bring them back to their roots, basically.
Yeah, like so many people these days have a dog, they like this breed, so they get it and it stays in the backyard. They might take it for a walk or down the dog park every now and then, but the breed was not designed for that. And I really find that giving them a job, and especially if that job is what they were intended to do, what's in their blood, they just thrive. And you don't have problems with food or aggression or barking and all that sort of thing. So it's an easy way to have a perfectly balanced dog. Give them a job.
Yeah, look, I would say humans are probably very similar, aren't they? Like, give a human the right kind of job, not just any job, but the job that we're sort of designed for, which is probably advancing civilization and connecting tribes and communities together. When we are focused on the right thing, we kind of tend to associate with the right people, and that tends to make us both physically and mentally look after ourselves better and just feel kind of more well-balanced. So yeah, I can see some parallels there, even for the Bitcoin space.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool idea.
Thank you.
Thinking about that for the rest of the day.
Well, I'm glad I could throw a bit of a epiphanous thing in there. Thank you again for your time, Michael. Thanks everyone for listening, and until next time.
Cheers. Thank you.